In the shadow of towering wealth, behind doors that seemed impenetrable, an unspoken truth was forged. A truth born not of love but of power, a moment of vulnerability exploited, buried beneath the weight of influence and the pretense of innocence. In a world divided by class and color, the story of a young black woman and the man who controlled her fate would remain hidden for decades. But secrets don't vanish. They linger, shaping lives in silence, waiting for the moment they'll erupt into the light. Imagine the echoes of that secret, a woman left to raise her son alone, fighting against a system designed to hold her back. A man, shielded by his wealth, continuing life unscathed. And then, imagine that child, now grown, learning the truth, not through whispers, but through the scars left behind. What happens when the child of the oppressed meets the oppressor? What happens when privilege is forced to answer to its past? This isn't just a story of betrayal. It's a story of resilience, of survival against all odds. It's about a mother who gave everything for her child and a son who refuses to let the sins of the past remain unanswered. What would you do if the man who built his empire on the backs of others was your own father? Could you forgive, or would you demand justice? For years, David buried his questions, focusing instead on building a life of his own. By his late 20s, he had become a man of success, a reflection of his mother's strength and his own determination. But the lingering emptiness of not knowing his past became too much to ignore. When Evelyn finally told him the truth, it wasn't just a revelation, it was a call to action. David pieced together his history through old letters, faded photos, and whispers from people who remembered the scandal. His search led him to the very gates of the mansion his mother had walked through decades earlier. This time, it wasn't Evelyn who would enter, but her son, armed with the truth and ready to confront the man who had denied his existence. What do you say to the man who refused to acknowledge you? What do you demand from someone who has everything while you've had to fight for every scrap? David's confrontation wasn't just about answers. It was about accountability. It was about forcing Charles to see the human cost of his indifference. The confrontation between father and son wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of a reckoning. Charles was forced to confront a truth he had long buried, but the question remained. Would he take responsibility, or would he cling to the privilege that had shielded him for so long? For David, the meeting was as much about his own closure as it was about challenging the system his father represented. But forgiveness wasn't easy. Accountability wasn't guaranteed. And as the two men sat across from each other, the weight of their shared history threatened to crush them both. In the end, this story isn't just about one man's redemption or another's justice. It's about the choices we make and the legacies we leave behind. It's about the scars of racism and the resilience of those who refuse to let those scars define them. And it's a reminder that the truth, no matter how long it takes, will always find its way to the surface. What if everything you thought you knew about your life, about who you were, was a lie? What if the truth was hidden from you for your entire existence? What if the answers you've been seeking for years were kept from you by the very people you trusted? It's a reality that far too many have experienced, but for one man, it's the revelation that will change everything. He was a billionaire, a man whose wealth and power shielded him from consequences, a man whose influence reached far and wide. To the world, he was a success story, a self-made titan who had everything at his fingertips. But what the world didn't know, what only a few could ever understand, is that his empire was built on more than just business acumen. It was built on decisions made in silence, decisions that for years he thought he had erased from existence. And then there was her, an employee, a black woman, whose value was often overlooked. She worked diligently, quietly, moving through the ranks of the corporate world that seemed to exist in a space of its own, a space where power and race intersect in ways that can never be ignored. It was here, in this world, where a chance encounter would forever alter the course of both their lives. Neither of them would understand its impact at the time. But when a child was born, it would mark the beginning of a truth that would not stay hidden forever. For 27 years, the child, raised in the shadows of his father's secrets, would grow up without knowing his true lineage. His mother, having made the difficult choice to protect her son from a world that might never accept him, raised him alone, never once sharing the identity of his father. But as the years passed, as the child became a man, the questions started to arise. Who am I? Why was I kept in the dark? And so, after decades of silence, the son would confront the billionaire, the father who had abandoned him before he was even born. It was a confrontation that no amount of money or power could shield from. The man who thought he could erase his past was about to face a reckoning. This isn't just a story about a father and son. It's the story of how systemic racism, power, and privilege create a cycle of denial and invisibility that affects lives in ways we often fail to see. It's a story of confronting uncomfortable truths and demanding accountability. As the son sets out to find the man who never acknowledged him, he is not just seeking answers for himself. He is confronting a world that allowed this to happen, a world that silenced his existence. And the questions that arise from this story are bigger than any individual. They challenge the very foundation of our society. There are truths that a parent hopes they never have to share with their child, truths that carry pain, regret, and memories they've worked hard to bury. For Evelyn, that moment came on a quiet evening, as David, now a grown man, sat across from her, searching for answers to questions he had carried his whole life. Her hands trembled as she held his. Tears welled in her eyes, and her voice cracked under the weight of the words she had kept hidden for so long. She told him everything, about the night that changed her life, about the man who had taken from her without thought for what he left behind, about the betrayal she carried in silence while she raised him alone. "I wanted to protect you," she said, her voice breaking, "but you deserve to know. You deserve the truth." The confrontation wasn't just about meeting his father. It was about demanding recognition, not for the wealth, the name, or the legacy, but for the humanity that had been denied him. Standing in the same room where his mother had once felt so powerless, David found his voice. "You don't know me," he said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions beneath it. "But I've lived every day with the consequences of your choices. My mother gave me strength when you gave her nothing. She gave me love when all you left her with was pain. And now I'm here, not for your pity or your guilt, but for your acknowledgement." The room fell silent. Charles, the man who had commanded boardrooms and built an empire, was now forced to face the one thing he couldn't control, the truth. David's words weren't just an accusation. They were a plea for something far greater than an apology. They were a call for humanity, for accountability, for justice. This story could have ended there, with words spoken, truths revealed, and silence filling the void where answers should have been. But David knew that his journey wasn't just about personal closure. It was about creating something larger. It was about ensuring that his story, his mother's story, didn't fade into the shadows of history, forgotten like so many others. He used his voice to shed light on the systemic inequalities that had shaped their lives. He spoke to communities, schools, and corporations, challenging them to confront their own biases and build a world where stories like his would no longer be possible. "It's not enough to say you're against racism," David said in one of his speeches. "You have to fight it, every day, in every choice you make. For my mother, for every person who's ever felt unseen, unheard, and unvalued. We have to do better." Evelyn's story didn't end in that mansion. David's didn't end in that confrontation. Together, they turned pain into purpose, ensuring that their voices would echo long after the final word was spoken. Because the fight against racism isn't just about the past, it's about the future we choose to create. Would you like me to expand on these moments or explore additional elements of hope and transformation? Imagine a life where every action, every decision is influenced by the weight of power, where money can shape the world and the rules of society bend to accommodate those who can afford them. But behind the veil of wealth, what happens when the truth about a man's choices is no longer something he can control? What happens when the past, once buried beneath layers of lies, returns to haunt him? This is a story of just that, a tale of power, secrets, and unspoken truths. A billionaire who thought he could escape the consequences of his actions, a woman who carried the weight of a decision made in silence, and a son who, after 27 years, could no longer remain in the shadows of his father's life. What began as an unlikely, even unspoken connection between a wealthy, powerful man and an employee, someone who worked under him in the halls of his empire, became a moment that neither of them could fully grasp at the time. One that would leave lasting ripples that neither power nor wealth could ever erase. She was just another black woman working under a powerful man in a world that had no place for her, where her contributions were minimized, her value overlooked. Yet, her life would forever be altered by an encounter, a moment when she found herself connected to the very source of her struggles. He was untouchable, a man whose privilege allowed him to make choices without facing the consequences. But even the powerful have a breaking point. Her pregnancy, a secret kept for years, was more than a reflection of her struggles. It was the living, breathing evidence of what society had failed to address. A child born into a world where his existence would be ignored by the very man responsible for him. A child raised in silence, an unspoken truth. Yet as he grew, he began to sense something wasn't right. He began to ask questions, to search for answers that no one was willing to give. And so, 27 years later, the son, now a grown man, sets out to do what so many before him could never do: confront the billionaire who had abandoned him, who had never once acknowledged the part he played in his life. What follows is a story of unrelenting courage, of a confrontation that holds a mirror to the systems of privilege, power, and the societal structures that enable them. A confrontation that will not only change the lives of those involved, but also challenge the way we look at accountability, race, and justice. This is where the past collides with the present. A man who thought he could control the narrative, a son who refuses to let him. What happens when the truth demands to be heard? What happens when a billionaire's wealth and influence are no longer enough to shield him from the reckoning of his own actions? Thank you for staying with us and diving deep into this powerful story. Stories like these remind us of the importance of confronting the past, questioning systems of power, and holding people accountable for the choices they make. But the work doesn't end here. If this story resonated with you, we encourage you to explore more about the effects of systemic racism and how we can all be part of the solution. In the description below, we've included links to important articles, petitions, and organizations that are working tirelessly to combat racism in our communities. These resources can help you learn more, get involved, and take action in your own life. Racism is not something we can solve in a single conversation, but by acknowledging these stories, by sharing them, and by taking action, we can start to create meaningful change. If you want to continue learning and be part of this conversation, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and share this video. Share it with someone who needs to hear this truth. But before you go, we have more stories to tell. In our next video, we'll explore how schools are beginning to confront racism head-on, changing the way we educate the next generation. Don't miss it. Together, we can build a better, more inclusive future. What would you do if the truth you've been living with for years suddenly came crashing into your life, forcing you to face the very reality you've spent your whole existence trying to avoid? The past, no matter how deeply buried, has a way of resurfacing when we least expect it. And for one man, that truth would come in the form of a son he never acknowledged, a son he never even knew he had, but whose very existence would challenge everything he thought he knew about his life and the world around him. He was a man of immense wealth, influence, and power, a billionaire whose wealth gave him access to anything he desired and immunity from the consequences of his actions. To the outside world, he was an icon, a man who had built an empire from nothing, a figure respected for his brilliance and success. But behind closed doors, behind the polished boardrooms and lavish parties, lies a different story. A story of a single decision that changed everything for one woman and would haunt him for the rest of his life. She was an employee, a black woman who worked under him in the early days of his empire, marginalized not just by her position, but by her race. She had dreams of making a difference, but those dreams were constantly interrupted by the harsh realities of systemic racism. In a world where her voice was often ignored, her worth constantly questioned, her presence merely tolerated, she found herself in an impossible situation. A situation that would not only alter her life, but would become the catalyst for a powerful reckoning decades later. A connection formed between them, one that neither of them fully understood at the time. He, the billionaire, a man of untouchable power and privilege. She, a woman trapped in the silence of inequality. What began as an accidental crossing of paths soon turned into something neither party was prepared for, a pregnancy. A child that neither of them knew how to acknowledge, let alone raise. And so as quickly as it began, it was buried, hidden, like so many uncomfortable truths that society tries to ignore. The child, born in the shadows, grew up without the man who was his father, without the recognition of a world that had no place for him. Yet as time passed, as the child grew into adulthood, something shifted. He began to ask questions, to search for answers that no one was willing to give him. For 27 years, his existence had been ignored. His mother had raised him in secrecy, but that secret could not remain hidden forever. As the years went on, the son began to piece together the truth, and with that truth came a sense of purpose, a need to confront the man who had denied him. And so, after decades of silence, the son sought out the father who had left him behind. A confrontation that, in many ways, mirrored the larger issues of inequality and racism that have plagued society for centuries. A confrontation that would not only change their lives, but would also demand that we ask ourselves, how far are we willing to go to face the truths we've spent a lifetime avoiding? This story is more than just the tale of a son seeking his father. It is the story of accountability, of justice, and of the long-lasting impact of systemic racism. It is a story of how power can shield one from consequences, but it is also the story of how the truth, no matter how deeply buried, will eventually come to light.